Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. In this week's episode, we're sitting here with Stephen Bown, whose new book that comes out on October 10th, 2023 is titled Dominion, the Railway and the Rise of Canada, all about the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad and how that came to be. So thank you so much for joining us today, Stephen.
It's my pleasure.
Well, to help set the stage for audience a bit, what was British Columbia like prior to the Transcontinental Railroad? So say with California, our first population boom predates rail travel by quite a bit. By the time that we're talking about the Transcontinental Railroad, we've already had a gold rush. We already have San Francisco, which is a growing city, Sacramento, things like that. Are there large cities in British Columbia before the railroad, and sort of what does the economy there look like?
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up is that Canada at that point in time had very different population centers and growth and economy and political development than the US. I mean, Canada was very sparsely populated. The country itself only came into existence in 1867. Just for perspective, that was the same year that the US acquired Alaska from Russia as a little addendum to the already existing country that was, spread across the entire continent. So anything west of the settled areas of the St. Lawrence area, between Toronto and Montreal, far to the east, was very sparsely populated. The Hudson's Bay Company territories, which were, the Hudson's Bay Company is that venerable British fur monopoly that more or less controlled and owned all of the commerce in most of northern North America. In fact, it controlled and owned, the current U.S. states of Washington, Oregon, Northern California, Idaho, parts of Montana. I mean, they were essentially a government as well as a monopoly trading corporation. Now, they were kicked out of there in 1846, and they ended up moving up north and setting up a little outpost on Vancouver Island, north of where the border was declared to be. But at British Columbia at that time, it was maybe several hundred fur traders and their indigenous wives and their families, and a few canoe routes that were traveling back and forth. Um, that also held true for all of what's called the Canadian prairies now, which are really just the same geographical region as the U.S. prairies, except that an imaginary line was drawn on it, but no one had marked this line, and no people lived there except for the indigenous people. And of course, why would they really care about this imaginary line that some people drew on a map somewhere back in the east and no one had marked anywhere? So they were generally not consulted on anything. So the situation is hardly any population existed in this region, hardly any political demarcation of any boundaries or barriers. Um, the fur trade outpost of Fort Victoria, which is what the city of Victoria is now, was more or less the only real settlement or city of any kind. And virtually all of Victoria's commerce was with San Francisco and other areas in California. Um, at the California, you mentioned the California Gold Rush, and they had, that's when the populated, California became popular with people from the east flooding up there. A lot of those same people had a decade after that flooded north into British Columbia, maybe 10,000 people, and they had inundated this small fur trade outpost of a few hundred people, and they had rushed up the Fraser River on a different gold rush. And this caused a lot of political tension in the area between who was going to govern it, there were no laws, there were no regulations, there was no standards of behavior, and there was a lot of chaos and fears of vigilante justice and violence. And then, of course, later there was a fear that, oh no, this is territory that Britain had claimed, and what if those dastardly Yankees were going to come in and declare themselves to be um, part of the United States, which is what had happened in in old Oregon, they called it. So there was a bit of political tension in the late 1850s and in the early 1860s regarding that. Um, but there was also a core group of people who wanted to maintain themselves as an independent state, which is nearly impossible to do since at that time, um, we're talking about maybe 1,000 people of any of maximum 1,000 people of any direct British background. Um, there was maybe tens of thousands of people who had flooded up from California and other areas in the United States, and some had returned home by then. It's hard to get an exact population figure for the region. And that's it. It was not a stable region. It was in total chaos. And so when the political debate at the time was, they had several options. They could just try to remain independent, which would be very nearly impossible since they didn't really even have a governing structure and they had no infrastructure. There was no roads. There was this one town and a bunch of shanty towns and villages and general chaos in the interior. Or they could join the United States, and that was a serious option, and many people considered it. In fact, that was the logical option, and probably would have been greater for their prosperity, at least in that time period, for the short period of the late 19th century. They would have probably been financially better off had they just continued their economic integration with the United States. But there was a core group of people who said, "We're approached by an Eastern government in Canada, which was, along the St. Lawrence. And they said, no, no, you've got to join the British colonies. We've got to maintain our British roots and we've got to, band together to create a country that'll stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And if you agree to join us in the East, we promise that we're going to build a railway to connect you to the East." Because, at that time, the only way for anyone in Victoria to get to, say, the capital city of the new country of Canada in the East was by taking a steamship down to San Francisco, getting on the railroad there, riding to Chicago or further east, and then taking a different train up into the Canadian provincial regions there. So, uh, yeah, you can see how the pressure was pulling them in two different directions. But in the end, there was a lot, this promise of this railroad and sort of induced a lot of people. They had votes and elections, and they agreed that they were going to go with this option. We're going to join Canada as long as you provide us with a railway, and that set in motion the whole, um, the somewhat insane, chaotic story of the manufacture of this railroad, which, of course, at the time was just a pipe dream. I mean, the sheer level of quantity of geography that they would have had to cross, and most of it all uninhabited. Part of it's not even mapped yet; it's not explored. And well, that's what created all the drama of the story. It was how the hell are they going to actually build this thing? The terrain that it was built to was a lot more challenging, a lot more geographically challenging, more difficult to cross than the terrain that the American railroads had recently built in '69. I believe it was first one around then. And because the key thing is that the geography south of Lake Superior is more or less rolling and flat terrain. North of Lake Superior is an absolute disaster. It's all just with that rock that they call Canadian Shield. It's just rocks and bogs, nearly impossible to construct anything over, and very hard rock for blasting. Um, yeah, that's what ended up the problem in the mountains of the Canadian Rockies and the Selkirks and the Purcell Ranges and all those different mountain ranges as you progress, further west from the prairies to the coast are well, the nearly insurmountable obstacles that nearly drove the entire entity to bankruptcy multiple times.
Yeah, what's interesting within that to me is, like these people when they're deciding which route to take, are they going to continue their economic integration with the United States and eventually become politically aligned with the United States as well, or agree to this Canadian plan? Like they know this is such like a pipe dream of a plan. Like it seems like at least they have some idea that this is going to be a very difficult process, and yet they still decide to do it eventually. Was it just like a nationalism thing? Like we've been a part of Britain, we want to continue to be a part of Britain. What was sort of the reasoning there?
I I think, I mean, that's definitely part of it for some of the people. However, like, I was mentioning a lot of the people who lived there had recently come from the US in the first place. And some of them voted in various elections or were outspoken members of parties or affiliations that wanted to join with this new country of Canada. So it's not, it doesn't necessarily fall directly on what political lines you would imagine because, well, like I said, the population wasn't all British, that's for sure, and yet that's what they ended up voting for. In that you're right that they probably must have known it couldn't really have been that easy. Anyone who'd been in this terrain, who'd gone up the Fraser River and looked at the sheer size of these mountains, and imagine how the heck you gonna get a railroad through anywhere like that? The canyons and the gorges and the cliffs, and that's just the part they could see. The other, thousands of kilometers stretching to the east into a place in the world that most of almost all of the people who lived there had never seen, had never. It was impossible for them to even conceive of how big an undertaking it would have been. So maybe that's what it was, is it was so daunting a task that no one actually, had an accurate conception of how difficult it would be to build it in the first place, and they just kind of figured, "Oh, yeah, why not? We'll join this we'll join this new country. They're gonna build us a giant railroad. We're probably gonna get that'll be really great for our prosperity. We'll do really well with the new railroad. The Americans, what are they offering anyway?" Even though most of them were technically Americans, they were saying, "Oh, that'll just be the status quo. We won't get a railway if we join the American." I'm you can never really have an exact answer on why that is, but those were some of the ideas being bantered around at the time.
For sure. And then looking at this from the American side, um, was there an attempt by the Americans to, try to sweeten the pot at all? Say, why don't you come with us instead of the Canada? That way, we have a clean shot from Oregon to Alaska. We can just go through British Columbia. Was there really any significant attempts by the American government, or any other players?
Well, the whole idea, this gets into the whole concept of manifest destiny, which is, um, the overriding belief that the continent should be controlled by, well, the United States, which of course, was a republic, had rebelled against Britain and had this idea that no European power should be anywhere. We're going to control our own destiny, and you people should get the hell out of here. Um, there was that idea that was, beginning around the 1840s, I guess. And that's what ended up being the motivating force for the way that Oregon and Washington and Idaho and these areas had kicked the Hudson's Bay Company out. That was that came after what was it? James Polk, I believe, 54-40 or fight. Isn't that 1846, I believe?
Yeah.
Um, I think that when it came several decades later, even if British Columbia was thinking that they were gonna vote into Canada, they assumed that either it would change its mind really quickly or that the entire
Mhm.
all of Western what's now called Western Canada was eventually just gonna go and become part of the US anyway, and so they didn't really worry too much about it because it wasn't worth very much. Of course, at the time, Alaska wasn't worth very much either. Wasn't it, 6,000,000 $7,000,000 that Russians sold it to? They had hunted all the sea otters to near extinction, and they hadn't found any oil yet, so if you consider all this as sparsely populated land, it's not worth anything. What do we care about that? And I imagine that they were thinking about that British Columbia too. What's there? Maybe a few bits of, some gold reserves or something, of which there was no shortage of in the US at the time anyway, and there's no population living there, and they probably imagined, "Oh, it's all gonna come to us anyway." And that was like that on the prairies too. There was a belief that, all of that western territory, that's now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta was also just gonna slide into the American orbit. Now, I should point out, at the time, the economy of the US was thriving and vibrant. Um, when immigrants to Eastern Canada arrived, like, say, they come up the St. Lawrence Seaway and they're getting off in Montreal or they're heading down, what they saw was a bunch of, a stagnant, stultified economy that was smothered and controlled by the government, and they didn't really want a part of it, and most of those people who arrived in Eastern Canada promptly fled to the US anyway. It was just a launching pad for them to go somewhere where their opportunity was gonna be much better. So, there's a lot of different forces at play during that time, and it's just it's really fascinating time period, and it's impossible to like summarize it so
Mhm.
succinctly. But they see all these competing forces dragging people this way, dragging people that way. But my belief is that they just imagine that the whole thing was going to slide to them anyway. Since look, in the eastern part of the country, anyone who arriving was already leaving to the US. So and the fear in Canada at the time, like just for the when I say Canada, I mean like the St. Lawrence Canada, the Eastern Canada that existed at that time. Um, they really did have a fear that if all these areas did eventually go to the US, and they imagined that it was going to as well. Like, they imagined all that prairies where the Hudson's Bay Company was, and there's not very many people living. I mean, they could see that, American prosperity was stretching out across the plains, railroads were being built, cities, towns, farms were all sprouting out, nothing was happening in the area that was later to become Canada. They had their own belief that all of that was gonna join the US too, and then they imagined that they were gonna be surrounded and they could see that anyone arriving in their territory also promptly fled to the US. So they imagined for them, it was an existential fear that their own existence, their own entrenched power structures would be, um, well, disrupted by this and that they would crumble as an independent state and eventually have to join the US anyway. Now, a lot of people wouldn't have cared because a lot of people were leaving and joining in the US in the first place. But, you know how in any society there's a hierarchy and there's people at the top and they have their entrenched self-interests and their control over businesses or however you want to think of it. I mean, those are the people who were really opposed to it because they would lose their exalted status, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. And yeah,
Yeah, no, I think
that's
that's an
those
interesting
are
way of
some of the
looking at
competing
it.
forces.
Yeah, well, it's the nation state, like, of Canada that's like, they have to contend with the fact that, the United States built the first transcontinental railroad, and now they have that Northwest Passage, a way to get from the East Coast to the West Coast, 7 days, 7 nights, that whole thing. And something your book talks about is just, like, how big of an impact that had on the American economy, as you're saying here. You get that prosperity boom, and now, yeah, now if you're Canada, you have to look around and say, well, with how big the economy is going for the United States, in large part because of that transcontinental railroad, now it looks like they might end up getting portions of what has eventually, in reality, become Canada. So can you talk a little bit more about sort of that? You're talking about in your book that there's this change in hat fashion that eventually, leads to a greater need for a transcontinental railroad. Essentially, yeah. What are the economic benefits we're looking for here, regarding a transcontinental railroad?
Yeah, I mean, interesting you mentioned the hat. I mean, for many centuries, the beaver hat was the cat's meow of the felt that they could make with beaver furs was just a fortune. It could be made into coats and especially into hats that ended up being waterproof and very durable. And for hundreds of years, that was the thing that everyone wanted. I mean, that was drove the beavers to near extinction everywhere from New York State and those areas around the Great Lakes region, and especially in the north and the west of Canada, where it's all that sort of swampy, rocky terrain, which wasn't good for much else other than beaver terrain at the time. Um, the Hudson's Bay Company was pulling beavers out. The beavers were especially a lot of them grew down in Oregon area too, along the Columbia River systems through there. So that was the main prosperity generating enterprise for a long period of time, but had gone into decline as fashion sometimes does. It had a really long run, but now everyone wanted silk hats. So beavers were out, silkworms from China were in, and that was causing a lot of economic disruption. Even in Montreal, but normally the center which had been serving the manufactured goods and the rum and the clothing and everything that's being shipped out there. Um, so that was an economic hit to them. And so the idea of the railroad would be the simple version of it is if we could just get this railroad built, and of course they had no idea it was going to take so long or cost that much or any of the logistical challenges they would face. That if we get this railroad built, then we can flood that area with settlers too, but we'll pass political rules and that'll create a captured market for our own moribund industries, which were stagnating and well, they just could not compete with the industry in the United States. So there was all these um, arguments over whether or not they should have free trade or whether they should have protectionism. Um, the industry in their mind just could not thrive or exist without a market of its own. And so part of the idea of the railroad was to create this market, build the railroad, send people out on the railroad, have them populate the area. They can be like peasant farmers growing out there. Um, take all their produce, ship it back on the railroad towards us, and force them to pay higher protectionism rates for manufactured goods that our own industry will then expand to produce. So that was the business model in the Eastern mines, was to sort of create an economic hinterland that could be exploited for the benefit of these same, family compact, these group of people that own the economy in the old Canadas.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, it's very similar to, it sounds like the Homestead Act in the United States, where you essentially gave land out to settlers as long as they populated unpopulated places, or not unpopulated, but unpopulated by that country's citizens. And and yeah, and the sort of the part of that is like now you have this territory that is occupied by your people, and now they're farming, and now you have this new industry and all these other kind of outgrowths from there. So I hadn't heard of that with a railroad specific tie-in there, but that's interesting.
Yeah, that's the
Mhm.
that's the business model of Canada as a how it actually came about. See, it's this idea that we have to create the market. So yeah, and part of the idea, the economics of railroads was an idea that was developed first in the United States. And you just alluded to it, like the idea that you give public land that has no one living on it, because the indigenous peoples had severely reduced by disease in the intervening decades before that, like tuberculosis, smallpox. I mean, up to 80% or more of these people had just succumbed to disease, and so the land was a great part of it was actually empty. And so when the government took over this land, it kind of imagined, okay, well, we've got this empty land. We'll give the empty land to the railroad for free if they promise to meet certain milestones for railroad construction. Um, and then the railroad can finance itself by convincing investors that once we build the railroad, we'll own all the land surrounding the railroad, and then we can sell the land at a profit to all the people who will be riding the railroad in. And then once they're in, we'll make even more money shipping out the produce that they start growing when they're there. And that was the American business model, and that had spurred massive quantities of thousands of kilometers of or thousands of miles. Sorry, of railroads were built all over the US following this business model, and it was a very successful one, and that was the one that the Canadian government tried to replicate for itself too, and that's how they funded the Canadian Pacific Railroad, was this same model, giving away the free land to the railroad that the railroad could then use as collateral to arrange financing with the idea of selling it back afterwards.
And then your book talks about some tensions between the investors that you're talking about, the people that want to make sure that the land that the Transcontinental Railroad for Canada covers is something that they can profit off of, and eventually sell, and all that good stuff. So some tension between them, and then the first Prime Minister of Canada, Macdonald, over what the route should actually look like. Can you talk a little bit about the different route options? Because I was pretty surprised to find out that like one of the options, maybe the more um, obvious one, would have just included parts of the United States in it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the geographical factor that I was mentioning earlier. The the um, the land north of Lake Superior is so hard to traverse in any way. It's not suitable really for railroads or roads or settlement or anything. It's just extremely difficult land. Um, so no one wanted the expense of building that because they couldn't even imagine. This was before minerals were discovered, I should point out. Now some of that land is extremely valuable because there's nickel and there's silver mines and there's other valuable thing are up in there in that Canadian Shield rock. But back then they thought, you can't farm this stuff. It's there's no soil. It's not flat. No one can live there. The forests are kind of scraggly. I mean, we have 1,000 miles of this crap. How are we going to afford to build a railway through it? Because it's normally the railroad has to pay for itself. And if so they didn't want to go through that land at all, and they were always secretly planning. Well, instead of doing that, we'll start building the railway just once we get to the west part of Lake Superior, and we'll build it across the prairies, and then we'll give the impression that we're going to start building this railway north of Lake Superior. But really, what we're going to do is send a bunch of spur lines south and tie into the American pre-existing railway, and not ever do the north of Lake Superior part at all. And that this is what the the first Canadian Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, wanted to avoid, because in his mind, he was a visionary, and the whole country of Canada is just his imagination. He said, "Look how successful the Americans are. We need to have our own country that also goes to the Pacific." I mean, this whole idea of Canada is something that he just dreamed up himself and really fought for decades of his career. And he was the one who just said, "No, if there's gonna be a railroad, it has to only go through the Canadian territory." Now, this was to cause enormous challenges and difficulties. It took 2 decades to build that thing, and it almost drove the entire country of Canada out of existence. The debts and the financing problems that it would have had, and all the banking system that was so leveraged into it when it was almost about to collapse. Um, it was him who forced that railroad to go north. The investors did not want to build that part of the railway, and in fact, they did not make a lot of money off of that stretch for ages, despite all the government subsidies and the land that was given to them. Eventually, it proved to be extremely valuable once they found those minerals, but yeah, really what they wanted to do was secretly pretend to be doing it, but then send spur lines and connect into the US rail system and just kind of ship everything south of Lake Superior. Now, if it wasn't for politics, that is the logical way that economic development should have proceeded in that region. This idea of building a railroad north of Lake Superior is really insane. There's no I mean, that's why the story is so dramatic, is because it makes absolutely no sense to have done it, right? Except for politics and people's imaginations on what should and shouldn't be done.
Yeah, which I mean, yeah, and if we go back to the motivations for Canada for building this thing in the beginnings, like it starts to make a little bit of that political sense, right? Where it's like, well, now if you have a transcontinental railroad in quotes that like just connects in with the American system, now you have a direct railroad, that the West is relying on the Americans, so that economic integration continues to happen. And now it also leads into your country. So does that sort of create economic integration between you and the United States now? And are you kind of fostering that choke point you were talking about, where the existence of Canada becomes questionable about whether or not they'll just integrate into the United States in general? Does that sound kind
Yeah,
of like
man,
the fear?
I I would say that that's absolutely the case, and it's not my own idea to say that. I mean, historians have studied that for a long time. There's really not much of a doubt. If this railway had not been built through the Canadian territory, all of Western Canada would just be, I don't know what configuration of states it would be, some that never got to see the light of day. They wouldn't be called Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. Anyway, it would be called something different. I don't know where the boundaries would have been, but it wouldn't have been part of Canada. It would have been U.S. That like you just mentioned, the economic integration would have led to cultural integration and political integration, um, of those regions. So, and that would have been, that would make a lot more geographic and economic sense for the continent to have gone that way. It's just the political sense, because of John A. Macdonald's strangely stubborn dream of having this country, is the only reason that it didn't actually go that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure we'll touch on it later, but it's interesting seeing that how the legacy of the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad eventually gets tied to all these nationalistic like symbols of it's like one of the big symbols of the nation. You have the Gordon Lightfoot Railroad Trilogy songs and all these other stuff that sort of connects Canada to the Transcontinental Railroad. And the United States, of course, had a lot of that as well. I feel like today it's a little less. It's like if we're going to talk about like the big engineering achievement in the United States, people will talk about the moon landing, things like that. The Transcontinental Railroad isn't it's not unheard of, but it's not as big of a symbol as it used to be. But it almost makes more sense for Canada, right? Even if it was the second, not the first, and all these other things, because um, without the Transcontinental Railroad, Canada probably wouldn't exist in the way it does today, at least.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah. So probably that's why. And it's always, I should point out, like it's always from an Eastern Canada perspective that the railway is like a great dream, and
Mhm.
that its dream was to construct it and to build it. I mean, at the time, as I was mentioning, there weren't any people other than Indigenous people. of any significant numbers living in anything that's called Western Canada at the time. I mean, even the US was sparsely populated in those northern states, but sparsely populated in a relative sense to the Canadian ones, where we could probably, or there might only been 500 people of any kind of European or Canadian descent and culture who were living in all of those regions at the time. And it would have gone up a few thousands, trickling in here and there, but really it was not a heavily populated region. At the time, I had mentioned the indigenous population, which at one time had numbered hundreds of thousands, had significantly reduced, sometimes up to 80%. So this was a primarily depopulated land, and it was going to something was going to happen to it because it wasn't going to remain depopulated forever. The farmland was good, the soil. It just, how was it going to be connected to the larger culture and the larger societies which were developing? Now, even in the US, that was mostly in the East, but with the railway, it was all across the United States at that time. Canada was something was going to happen to it, and it was probably going to go into the orbit of the United States. And well, the railway is the only reason it didn't.
Um, okay, so before we get into construction bits, you started mentioning it there a little bit, which was like I want to touch on the sort of change in the Indigenous relationship with Canada, and with a lot of these settlers, between sort of the planning stages. They're coming up with how to build the Transcontinental Railroad and that sort of thing. And then, when we were talking about these beaver outposts, you mentioned a lot of the settlers had Indigenous wives, and it seems like though there was a shrinking population here, that it's more integrated. Does that sound right? And then eventually, when we're talking about like large scale settlements, that's when we're seeing the full sort of disenfranchisement aspect of it.
Yep, that's probably true. I mean, around this time in the late 1770s, the Canadian government signed a whole series of treaties with Indigenous peoples in the territory west of Lake Superior. And not oddly enough, in British Columbia, which had a series of smaller treaties, were signed by Governor Douglas, who was the head of the Hudson's Bay Company, who also became the British appointed governor of the territory. They had their own little system where a lot of the land, because of the extreme depopulation, the reserves there tended to be very small. Whereas on the prairies, the treaty systems covered big sections of land that were sparsely populated, but the size of the reserves where the indigenous people had originally, it was tended that that land was going to be reserved for their exclusive use, but the rest of the land would be open to everyone. Now, uh, it's a bit of a sad story. It didn't materialize the way that the original signatories, probably on either side, imagined. Certainly not the indigenous uh, peoples, who took a real beating for. Well, they're still taking a beating now, because there was a series of rebellions, and they were punished severely for that and not allowed off of these reserves. Um, in our country, Indigenous people were not allowed to vote until 1960, I should point out. So, completely, how do you even get your voice heard within a theoretically democratic system if you're not even allowed to vote or to have representatives within that system, right? So, um, a lot of really bad, sort of morally dark things happened during that time. There's a whole idea of the residential schools where the children were taken, and not always 100% against their wishes of the parents. Sometimes the parents knew that they had to do something, but a lot of these schools were not ethically run. Um, I don't know. That's not really having to do with the railway, but that it stems from the railway, because the treaties were signed uh, because they wanted to sort of clear the land for the railway so there wouldn't be any warfare or violence or disputes. But at the same time that those treaties were being signed to make way for the railway, we see the complete destruction of the buffalo population, or the the American bison, and that happened in the U.S. at the same time that it happened in Canada, maybe a few years earlier. But it was spurred on, ironically, the railways in the US brought a lot of people out onto the prairies, and that's when they began hunting buffalo on such a scale that it completely the population had been decline already, but it just kind of drove it over a cliff because thousands more people could participate in these great buffalo hunts. Their hides were used for machine belts in the Industrial Revolution because they were very valuable. Buffalo robes were really popular. They're very useful clothing. So with the large population centers wanting the products from these buffalo and increased ability for people to hunt them, the numbers of them, which used to be like 100 million of these things, um, they were basically wiped out near extinction by the early 1880s, and that caused widespread starvation. Um, by weakening people with malnutrition, it allowed disease to take even a stronger hold. The story is the same in the U.S. as it is in Canada. It happened so rapidly that, especially in the Canadian territories where there was no railroad yet completed at that time, how would a central government even attempt to alleviate those problems? They have no way of getting there. There's no road, there's no railway, there's no way of sending boats around into it. And when they did try and send some food relief, it's the same situation we were talking about. It came west on American railways to Fort Benton, and then was brought up with carts across the prairies into the border, or some steamships came up from St. Paul in Minnesota, trying to get into the territory that way, because there's still no way for a Canadian government to even get access to to these lands that they claimed for themselves. So a great number of people starved. There was huge degree of hardship during that time, and that's exactly the years that the railway was pressing through across the prairies. It was only just before that the treaties had been signed, and there's a very turbulent and chaotic time.
Yeah,
Could go on forever
yeah,
talking
for
about,
sure.
but
Well, one of the things there that's, I mean, it sounds obvious, and I guess it is kind of obvious, but I hadn't thought of before reading this book and talking with you. Um, you know, bison don't know about national borders. Like yeah, they're on both sides, right? Like the bison are
yeah,
hanging out
yeah.
both prairie locations. So both Canada and the United States have a similar history here regarding buffalo destruction, bison destruction. They have similar economic needs. They want, as you talking about the Industrial Revolution, sort of increasing the need for these bison and things like that. It's one of those things where you're reminded sometimes of how arbitrary the borders become when as you mentioned before, there's no markers delineating the difference, and clearly the bison don't care.
The bison certainly don't care. They're just looking for good grazing pasture, and yeah, I mean, no one the border hasn't even been marked yet,
Hmm.
and there was no reason for anyone to care about it. And from an American point of view, they're certainly not worried about this northern border. In fact, they probably imagine this northern border probably won't exist for too much longer. That's in their minds, because why would it, right? I
Hmm.
mean, and yeah. But the buffalo, yeah, they just go roaming all over, and I'm just amazed at the speed that they went from essentially being a food source for anyone who wanted to would have unlimited food from these bisons. Within one generation, they're completely gone to extinction. It's remarkable that, but I guess there's that whole idea of the tipping point, right?
Hmm.
It starts, the population is declining, but not enough. Everyone is able to keep seeing that there's a large number of bison still, and time goes by, and maybe there's a little bit less, but there's still an unlimited number of them. And then all of a sudden, within a couple of years, all of them seem to have disappeared. And
Yeah.
there was a small few pockets, and then those were quickly rounded up and more or less gone.
Well, some of the photographs too, they're amazing, and in the you know the sheer amount of, I'm sure you've seen in like the skulls, the piles and piles and piles, and it's just like the fact that one, there's so many obviously, and they're deceased, but just like there were that many bison around and hanging. This is just one photograph of it. the size I think
Yeah,
is hard for us to fully grasp.
it's hard to conceive of that many, of those animals. I mean, I remember some early traveling accounts of, people going across the prairies in the US, decades before they were gone, but they would describe, like, camped out on a little rise, a hill, and have to wait for, like, days for the herd to go by. They couldn't move. There was millions of them. There was for some reason, they were on the move. I don't know why. What would cause them to move? The seasons or something, but I mean, they were camped there. They could not actually find their way through the herd. They just had to wait. They just had to sit there waiting while the herd just sort of split around them on the hill and just was gone. Like, for days, they had the
Yeah.
sheer number of them is just absolutely staggering. And of course, that was the entire, well, not the entire, but let's say 90% of the food source of all of the Plains Indians, the indigenous ones. It was also their source of, materials for all their clothing, materials for all the different lodges that they made. So when the bison disappeared, a lot of these people were not. It wasn't that they just didn't have a food source. It's that yes, they didn't have a food source, but it also didn't have a source of clothing, and they didn't have a source of shelter, and they didn't have a source of a whole bunch of other things too. And so they went from being masters of everything to being absolutely having nothing and no economic role within their own territories, which is a pretty hard thing to have happen within one generation.
So speaking about we're talking about, the Industrial Revolution and how it's impacted the environment. Something else you talk about in your book, speaking of the construction process now, is a big technological change that the Industrial Revolution helps set off here, and that's the invention of the dynamite, something that wasn't around for the Central Pacific to use for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad with the Sierra Nevada mountains, but something that proved to be a game changer for the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad. Can you talk a little bit about how the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad was able to use dynamite, and sort of how that helped them when we're talking about those nearly impossible terrains?
Yeah, I would, just to declare right off, without the invention of dynamite, there would be no Canadian Pacific Railroad. It would be impossible to build it. Even the American ones, I mean, it was very hard for them to. When you read the accounts of how they were blasting through the Sierra Nevadas, the sheer quantities of gunpowder, like barrels and barrels of gunpowder stacked up against rock faces to try and blast it. I mean, then they went on to using nitroglycerin, which of course extremely volatile and dangerous. Nitroglycerin was just the unstable uh, components of dynamite that was also invented by Alfred Nobel, just a year, I think, earlier than dynamite. Nitroglycerin was very volatile and it could explode and just blow people's arms off or cause all kinds of injuries and damage. It couldn't be transported. Um, but yeah, the dynamite, I mean, it's at least 10 times as powerful as gunpowder, but because it was manufactured into small, stable sticks, you could drill into the rock, place dynamite sticks into the rock, and blow the rock out from behind, which is something you could not do with old black powder or gunpowder. Um, so it's not just that it was more powerful; it's that it could be placed in better locations to cause greater explosions, and that was a complete game changer. I mean, as soon as dynamite was invented, all the great industrial mega projects of the 19th century, all these massive rail tunnels, the St. Gothard Rail Tunnel, these gigantic things that are between Italy and Switzerland and northern parts of Europe that allowed commerce in Europe to really thrive too at that time. All of that came after dynamite. Dynamite completely revolutionized, the technological revolution, allowed for a political and an economic revolution afterwards. All these sort of patterns of transportation where bulk goods could suddenly be transported at a reasonable expense along canals or rail beds could be. All of that happened because of dynamite, which opened up whole regions of the continent for agriculture, for mining, the economy was completely transformed because these regions, if it was inaccessible from before and wasn't already on and easily, uh, if it wasn't on the Mississippi system or some other barge that barge network that was naturally flat, it would have been off limits for economic development. With dynamite, all of a sudden the economy just took off and people could go everywhere. And we have a whole networks of roads, railways, canals, harbors proliferating across the entire continent. And that's what also enabled the blasting through all the granite and other hard rock of the Canadian Shield for the tunnels and to level land the ground for the CPR too, and to get its way through the Rocky Mountains. You know, you could blast mountainsides, level the terrain off. It was not possible before. It would have taken. I mean, look, this Canadian railroad took 2 decades to build. I mean, it could have taken 100 years before, but there's no way anyone could have ever afforded to have done it. It would be impossible.
And who was it that was doing this work? What was the workforce makeup?
I think, you know, the workforce on the CPR was probably similar in nature to the workforces on, you know, the US railroads. A lot, I mean, the US had a much larger population center to draw from. A lot of the workers on the Canadian one were recent immigrants from Europe, probably a lot from Britain and Ireland. You know, the famous Irish were working on the railway. Um, in Canada, those were the same people, like sort of impoverished, not mostly illiterate, not highly skilled workers living in very poor conditions in labor camps that were often at the end of the rail. You know, they were supplied by the existing rail that was built behind them. So as they worked further across the terrain that they were building, um, uh, this is how the railway was able to build. As the rail progressed, access to sort of food supplies, and clothing and more equipment, they created their own logistical supply lines as they progressed across the continent. But it would have been a miserable job, I suspect, living especially in the Canadian winters, in those areas north of Lake Superior would. I mean, that's harsh terrain. I mean, the winds and the freezing cold temperatures, and they're trying to live in well these poorly constructed log cabins without any real heating, or sometimes just a canvas tents for a lot of the season. Imagine the flies and the black flies and of course there's no refrigeration, there's no electricity, and there's no oil and gas. So there's no real energy sources. So everything has to be chopped from wood, or they could burn some coal maybe. Food couldn't be preserved. So the diet that they ate was very poor, heavy on salted, everything salted a lot in order to survive. Not a lot of fresh fruits and or vegetables, or um, like diseases such as the malnutrition type diseases, but particularly like scurvy was quite common in the winter season. With the um, people's gums would start to turn black and they would lose all the strength in their limbs and they'd be bleeding out of old wounds. I mean, some of these people survived just truly horrendous conditions working on those. And
Well, I'm curious too. So for the American Transcontinental Railroad, we're talking about like a 6-year process. So if you started at the beginning, theoretically you could make it to the end, and that's a big segment of your career, your work time. But when we're talking about the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad, you talk about it's a 2-decade process. Were there people that were around for that whole 20 years or so?
I don't think anyone was, especially not the laborers. Some of the people involved in the politics and the financing might have been there from the beginning, but it had some rough periods too. I mean, there was the whole survey crews. I mean, this 20-year period involves from the earliest crews being sent out. Now they had a rough job too because this terrain is all forested and there's no roads, and of course, ironically, there's no railroad, so there's no way to get to it. They had to walk or canoe through everything and try and survey where this route should go. So, I mean, those people had a rough job too, but at least they were free to go hiking, wander around. They had a lot more latitude in their daily life, whereas a lot of the laborers are just there. The everything's done with manual power, sledgehammers and hand saws and oxen teams to haul stuff. I mean, it's brutal hard work. And I just got off track there. What were we just?
Oh,
What
we're
was
we're
the
talking
point?
about whether or not you could theoretically, but it sounds like the conditions might just be so difficult that like you're realistically not spending 15 years as a labor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true, and the Canadian Railway, it started and then it stopped for a little bit, and there was a government took it over for a while when there was but there's an election and John A's government lost and a new government came in, and they wanted to run it as a government project and instead of a private enterprise project, and under the government project, it was very inefficient and not much got done, and there was a lot of political corruption and land is sort of given off to for patron. But hardly anything got done during that 4-year period, and then it went back to being a private enterprise again and sort of restarted up. I seriously doubt any of the workers remained through to the completion of it. But the last phase of it, there could have been, let's just say the last several years. It was completed in 1885, but let's say the last 4 years or so, there could have been people who worked on it for that length of time, like the big push across all the way across the prairies and through the Rocky Mountains and down those canyons of the Fraser River into British Columbia. There was also uh on the British Columbia part of the railroad going along the Fraser River. At one time, there was significant contingent of American workers who were brought up to do some of that work. However, um, the pay was not as good as what they could get in other areas, and the conditions were harsher, and so almost all of them left. It was not worth their while to be there. The economy sort of picked up again in the US, and they found greener pastures, and they all fled and left British Columbia and moved back. Not
The
all. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure to some did, but as a group, they no longer formed part of the workforce, and there was severe labor shortages, which is why Chinese workers were eventually brought in, similar to the situation in the US. Labor brokers in China would recruit people and sell their contracts on. They were brought in. The Canadian government passed the legislation to allow them to be brought in by the railroads corporation, which dealt specifically with these labor brokers and brought them in. The conditions in China at that time were absolutely horrible. I mean, China was going through great upheavals. There was disease, there was famines, there was floods, there was political disintegration. China was not a good place. There were millions of people fleeing China, and a lot of these Chinese workers ended up all over the world building railroads. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. I mean, um, Chinese workers were fleeing their own country and coming in. They were being paid less money for more dangerous jobs, because it was all negotiated with the labor brokers that signed them in, who just took a cut of their wages as once they were here. But that caused a lot of political contentions because by working for lower wages, they were undercutting the wages that the regular workers were getting paid. And there was, some of the unions that were negotiating and trying to push for better conditions for the North American workforce saw their desire for improved conditions being undercut by people who were working for, I think they were getting like 20% less pay, but um, they were also responsible for providing their own food and medical conditions, and they didn't demand a lot of things like proper cook camps and proper shelters to live in. They were living under much rougher conditions, and it was kind of left. So it was very cheap from the company's point of view to have these Chinese worker, and they were often assigned to do the most dangerous jobs, like the dynamite blastings on cliffs, where just one example of a labor practice that is no longer in force today. In order to blast off the cliff, they would go to the top of the cliff, tie a person around the waist, give them a bunch of dynamite in their hand, lower them down a rope. They would stuff the dynamite into some cracks. They would light the dynamite because at that time the fuse had to be lit, and they would yank on the rope and yell, and that was the time to pull them up really fast before before it explodes and blows the thing out. Or you go into the tunnel a long way and you place the dynamite deep into the tunnel, and then you just have to light it the longest fuse you could get, and then run like hell before it explodes. And sometimes the roof would come down and crush a whole bunch of them that were in there.
Mhm.
And like conditions were truly awful, and that was more so. It was bad for the regular workers, but it was especially bad for some of the Chinese ones who were given these most dangerous jobs for the lower pay.
Yeah, and that tracks with a lot of the discrimination that we saw for on our side of the border with the Transcontinental Railroad. Same thing where they got paid a little bit less, about 20% less, and then also had to provide for their own sort of living situations and things like that. One thing I'm curious about, so you mentioned that primarily the Chinese workers for the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad were hired during that last portion, last like 3 or 4 years or so. Does that sounds like it lines up pretty well with the Exclusion Act of 1882 in the United States? Is there any like, oh, okay, well now these Chinese workforces can't get into the United States. Canada seems to be the next best option. Is that sort of what's happening there?
Yeah, I believe that that would be the case, and, some Chinese who were in the United States
Mm.
came north at that time, and like we were just mentioning, there was the border was really nothing, you just would walk across it. It wasn't really marked and no one was paying attention to it. So, you know, one of the people found when it was a really amazing discovery. The journal of a Chinese worker who worked on the CPR for many, many years, um, was only recently discovered several years ago, and parts of this journal, you know, detail his life as he first crossed over to the United States, and he worked, I believe it's in Washington State, but he didn't really know exactly where he was because none of them spoke any type of English. Um, Most of the Chinese workers were completely illiterate. They were the uneducated peasants. This fellow, although he was educated in China, his family had fallen in uh, to disfavor with the imperial government and had lost all their status and their position, and so he was forced to flee. So he wrote his journal of first going to the United States and then coming up into Canada. I don't even know that he distinguished that he was in two different countries. He didn't
Mm.
seem to mention it, and he described the cities by different names than what they were known for. But he detailed his life as a laborer for several years, and is the only account of a Chinese rail worker that's ever been found, and it's very recent. Anyway, it sheds a lot of light on the conditions that they endured while they were working there, and that the different types of discrimination that they had, and um, the diseases that were getting them, how harsh the conditions were, the danger. Yeah, it's really fascinating. Duke Sang Wong, the Diary of Duke Sang Wong. I'm not sure in the U.S. how many accounts of Chinese workers exist there. That yeah,
Yeah, we don't have
because
any
a lot
here
of these
either. So
people.
that's the first I've heard of there being one for the Canadian one. That's a real that's awesome. You
It's a
said it's
new
recent. That's awesome.
discovery. It's it's very new. I mean, I know no one can see this, but I'm showing
Mhm.
you the copy of it.
Yeah.
It just came out. It's a slim volume.
Wow.
It was discovered in the basement of their house or the attic of their old house, and the family didn't hardly know what it was really. And someone translated, like one of the great granddaughters of this fellow, translated the account and put it out there. It's like only a year, 2 years old.
Yeah. Well,
So
that's
it's
that's one
quite
of those
amazing.
great things, right? Like the knowledge base that we are working with continually grows, and I've always been hopeful that same type of thing that there's just some type of diary or some type of journal out there from a Chinese railroad worker that worked on the American Transcontinental Railroad that will just it'll pop up someday, and you
Yeah,
can keep
it could
searching
be. I mean,
maybe.
this one, I mean, he was in the US and he
Hmm.
was in Canada, but he mostly worked for the CPR. His railroad work was CPR.
Yeah,
But
I'll definitely check it out.
yeah,
That I'm sure there's yeah, as we've been mentioning, there's so many similarities here. Okay, so after the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, what happens to, I guess, and this could be a couple different answers depending on if you're a Chinese railroad worker or if you're one of the Irish workers or the indigenous workers. But essentially, what happened to the workforce? In the United States, we saw with the Chinese railroad workers, they often continued working for the railroad companies, maybe try signed on to different companies, moved into agriculture, things like that. Was that a similar dynamic here?
I believe that's sort of the same idea. I mean, once the railroad was completed, of course, there's always ongoing demands for, the maintenance of it. And in the case of the CPR, the quality of track that was originally built was often very poor. They just needed to get the thing done so they could get some kind of functioning rail line working. Um, like the company itself was basically bankrupt and had leveraged so many loans that were backed by the government of Canada. The entire country could have just gone flop if they hadn't just got something working. But what they had working was of such low quality that it needed to be constantly maintained, and whole sections of track rebuilt afterwards in the coming years. So a lot of the Chinese workers continued to work on that, along with other ones too, like other workforce from the Irish and other European areas. But a lot of there wasn't enough demand on the railway alone for all of the Chinese workers, because at one time there's many thousands of them just on the Canadian section in British Columbia. A lot of them were just turned off, like they were just turned out into the world. Oh, go fend for yourself, which is very hard to do because, owing to a whole bunch of different reasons, they had not culturally integrated at all. Many of them didn't speak any English. Um, they've remained a distinct force that was not viewed favorably by that time in the 1880s. Um, a lot of discrimination against them, and some turned. I think there was a comment in British Columbia that basically all the small grocers and the small gardeners across the entire province were basically Chinese at that time.
Mm.
So a lot of them turned to small scale agriculture, and they were prevented from working on any government contracts. Like there was laws saying no Chinese worker will be able to work in the mines. No Chinese worker will be able to work on this road project. They were excluded from large sections of the economy. But I guess, you know, uh,
Yeah, no, and that's the thing about this story that always gets to me is just how similar these two things are. I mean, it makes some sense that they're large railroads. We're neighbors. A lot of the workforce overlapped, and it's not that many years separating it either. But considering, as we've mentioned, like so much of the story of these railroads have come to be symbols for their respective nation, it's interesting that like yeah, I mean, there's another one that happened that has almost the same story that's supposed to be symbolic of another country, like it doesn't feel all that unique, even if it's still only two, but you know what I'm saying?
yeah. Well, I guess like the terrain is not that different.
Hmm.
The technology is not that different. Um, the workforces at that time had to have come from similar places because, well, the U.S. and Canada really weren't all that different back then, and the people just went back and forth over the border. Like I have ancestors who who came, they were in Nova Scotia for a while, and then they decided they were just going to move to Boston. So they just sailed their boat there, and then all of a sudden they're in Boston now. No one cared. There was no document for anything. I mean, these people just went where they felt like it, and yeah, so it's not surprising that they'd be quite similar. The same technology, steam and dynamite, and hard work with manual labor and animals for the uh, for the horsepower, and yeah, same food, the same. Yeah, in fact it's pretty much exactly the same. We're just like a few years later in time,
Yeah.
decade later in time, I guess.
Um, Okay, so looking at sort of the big picture here for Canada, we talked about the political need, the desire of McDonald to make sure that this is a Canada only route. Eventually, all this is successful. They almost go bankrupt, but they managed to figure it out right before that sort of consequence kicks in. Um, did the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad eventually, realize all those hopes and dreams that the investors as well as that political class seek for it?
Uh, I think it took way longer than anyone imagined that it was going to take, obviously, and cost way more than anyone ever could have conceived that it would, nearly bankrupting the country, which kept financing it because it became too big to fail, essentially, right? Like if it did, everything was going to collapse. Um, but it did pay off really big time for the people who stuck with it and had a lot of the shares, and the company itself that owned all this land around the rail centers. Especially when minerals were discovered north of Lake Superior and all that rock land. Oh, all of a sudden that land, which they had written off as being valueless, all of a sudden it became extremely valuable. Oh, we can have mining towns now, and we're shipping the ore back and forth. Okay, an unexpected, part of the business plan that is all to the upside for them. Um, yeah, I mean the population that started flooding in the 1890s into Western Canada. I mean, that's when Western Canada started to see its population increase by significant numbers. And of course, all of that tied into the economic hinterland of the St. Lawrence, original Canadas along the St. Lawrence system. And it did create a huge economic boom for a lot of the industry that existed there. The original investors in the CPR, um, well, a lot of them became some of the wealthiest people. I mean, they made so much money from that because um, the government grants that had been given for the free land went up in value more than anyone thought that it ever was going to. And then there was a fellow named Van Horn, Cornelius Van Horn. He was originally from the area around Chicago. He ended up being in charge of the CPR. In fact, a lot of the people who were in charge of the CPR, this is I always wanted to mention this, that just to make a diversion, um, a lot of the people in charge of the CPR, the great irony is that this is viewed as Canada's grand nation-making industrial mega project, without which the country wouldn't exist and blah, blah, blah. Everyone talks about it and mythologizes it. Um, it's so closely tied to Canada. The great irony is a lot of the people in the upper echelons of the management and the planning and even the surveying were actually Americans. Whether you have Major A.B. Rogers, the great surveyor who found the passes through the Rocky Mountains, the Rogers Pass through British Columbia, the biggest, most dangerous pass that it went through. I mean, he was a U.S. fellow, and he went back there afterwards. Andrew Onderdonk, who was the great engineer that pioneered the way of getting all um, the railway built through the canyons of the Fraser River system. He was originally from New York, and he went back to California after. Um, and well, Cornelius Van Horn, he ended up staying in Montreal and becoming one of the wealthiest people in the country, living in giant mansions in the richest area. But I mean, he was originally from Chicago area, and all of his senior managers and engineers, he preferred to bring in people that he knew from his time working on U.S. railroads. So anyway, it's a bit of an irony there, and I always thought that it was kind of funny that it's so nationalistically tied, and yet even the upper echelons of it were not had nothing to do with Canada at the time. And but it was Cornelius Van Horn who also pioneered the whole Canadian National Park system. So one of his other ways of generating traffic on the railroad was to out in these very scenic areas in the Rocky Mountains and other mountain ranges between Calgary and Vancouver, was to build a bunch of these chateaus or really nice areas to stay and market it to, very well off Europeans and Eastern Americans to come and take the great scenic tour of the world's greatest places, Chateau Lake Louise. And
Mhm.
but a lot of these places generated additional high-end traffic on the railway because it was all ultra luxury, like fine dining the whole way, stay in these great chateaus, and then the Canadian National Park system was all built around that too. Banff National Park was originally built as a reason for the railway to offer a stop for tourism,
Mhm.
and so that also generated a lot of traffic on the railway. And then, of course, once you came to Vancouver, it was a port system, and, at the time, the British Empire was at, one of its most powerful, world-girdling size of it at the time, so it was a link in the British Empire, to create an economic system which wasn't entirely dominated by the United States, which was, as we know, a huge economic powerhouse and was on its way to ascendancy in the 20th century and dominating the economy and the economic transfer routes around the whole world. But the British system at that time was also very powerful, and this rail line was a way that you could connect, like, Hong Kong to, to get to Vancouver. Then goods could come on ships and then go on railways and end up in Montreal, and from Montreal, they could go on the St. Lawrence and end up all the way in England, right? So it was a new chain in the world girdling link of the British Empire at the time.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and it's funny you mentioned the national park thing. That's a very similar story, of course, in the United States. The park system sort of follows the railroads, and that, like, America First, that was the slogan to get people to try to, vacation in America before going to Europe, so that's why it's called America First. And yeah, same thing, but it's just this interesting connection between, we talked about the environmental problems with the railroad and sort of increased settlement, creating those problems for the bison and all these other issues. Um, the sort of catch 22 is like, okay, but it's also creating national parks. So there's always that kind of both sides of it. But we talked a lot about Canada, the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad, how it's memorialized as that, like, symbol for the Canadian nation, things like that. Um, what do you think? We talked about sort of the problems with that. Have you thought at all about what the legacy should be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of these people that likes to see both sides of issues, and it perfectly open to seeing, or just appreciating that, something can be very complex. Like, it can be morally complex, economically complex, politically complex. There's no, I don't subscribe to the old rah rah. Isn't this great? There's no downside, but I don't want to crap on it either. I mean, it's amazing, an amazing engineering and technical triumph that it, and a financial and a political triumph that something like that could be conceived of, designed, and built at that time using that technology and all the people who poured their lives into it. It's
Yeah,
complex, and that's what makes it interesting, is that it's not so simple. Simplistic, I guess, is the it's avoids simplicity.
yeah. No, I
More
think
interesting if it's more complex.
that's a good way to think about it, and I think your book does a great job at sort of hitting on those things. It certainly doesn't leave out any of the bad sides of the stuff that happened, but it also talks about it as a technological achievement and as something that, you know, in large respects made Canada what it is today. So I think it's an awesome book that people should check out. I found it on Amazon. Is there a recommended place of purchasing it, or is it just wherever you get your books?
It's all good. Yeah, any
Cool.
place that sells books. Amazon's all perfectly fine too. Yeah.
Sounds good. Again, for listeners, that is Dominion, the Rise, or the Railway and the Rise of Canada. We'll have a link to that in the description. I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was a lot of fun to, again, see those comparisons between the American Transcontinental Railroad and the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad.
Yeah, thanks. It was my pleasure. It was a great conversation.
Thank you for listening to Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to leave us a review, like, and subscribe so you'll get more information about when our next episode drops. And in the next couple episodes, we're going to be diving further into the Canadian railroad system, talking about the consequences of the Transcontinental Railroad in Canada, as well as its lasting impact on Canada and the Canadian transportation systems. Thank you again for listening, and have a great week.